A military helicopter touched down in the inner courtyard of the base, whipping up clouds of dust across the concrete slabs. Several officers in crisp uniforms and one man in a suit emerged from its belly. 3 soldiers posted at the courtyard entrance stood nearby with their weapons at the ready, keeping a close watch on the arrivals. The officers and the civilians' faces looked tense, their movements hurried, as though time itself were driving them forward. They crossed the courtyard quickly and entered the administrative building. The corridors were dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of cheap coffee and worry. A lieutenant colonel who introduced himself as Sterling greeted them by a massive door leading to a conference room deep in the headquarters. 2 armed guards stood by the threshold, admitting only those on the list for the classified meeting. Once Sterling closed the door behind them, everyone took their seats around a long table spread with maps. On the map of the Appalachian Mountains, several areas were marked in red. Sterling indicated one of the largest sections, where earthquakes had caused landslides and huge fissures in the earth. He noted that such seismic activity in these mountains was rare. No similar spikes had ever been recorded here before. As a result of the quakes, craters had formed, revealing caves unknown to anyone. Some scientists believed those caves might contain rare earth metals valuable to industry. Consequently, the government had sent in geologists, mining engineers, chemists, and geophysicists. They arrived and transmitted their initial findings. Then communication went silent. Sterling shuffled through several photographs. They showed sinkholes and shifted layers of rock. Researchers' tents stood nearby, but no one knew what had happened to the people. Next, he said that rescue teams had been dispatched. Local rangers, volunteers, then a group of police officers along with the sheriff. But they disappeared as well. The FBI agents who arrived afterward also lost contact. Only one fragmented message remained. "Something's following us. It seems big." And that was it. Silence. The man in the suit, identifying himself as a representative of the intelligence services, added that the government was desperate. Attempts to use drones and helicopters equipped with high-tech cameras had failed. The machines lost control and plunged into the craters for no apparent reason. Even backup communication channels stopped working near the fissures. It seemed the anomaly was jamming signals, preventing reconnaissance. Meanwhile, no one returned to offer a coherent explanation. Sterling explained that a decision had been made to deploy a small Delta Force unit. The objective was careful reconnaissance, a search for possible survivors, and a determination of the causes behind these disappearances. Additionally, they were to be prepared to destroy the cave system entirely if it turned out that something of national threat lay hidden there. This was an extreme measure, but there was no other choice. At that moment, one of the military personnel opened a second door, and Captain Ray Fox Dalton stepped into the room. He wore a simple field uniform with a fox patch on his chest. According to Sterling, the captain had 15 years of service behind him, 8 of those in Delta. Dalton positioned himself next to the map without unnecessary words, showing he was ready to receive instructions. Sterling got to the main point. The unit would consist of 6 to 8 people, all chosen from elite ranks capable of operating independently and without communication with headquarters. No official reinforcements would be sent, because risking larger groups under these conditions was impossible. Whatever was happening near the fissures not only disabled communications, but caused entire teams to vanish. Intelligence agencies did not rule out the possibility of encountering predatory creatures or an unknown form of life, but there was no solid data. The intelligence representative briefly mentioned additional reports. The missing people had indicated they were being followed, as though whoever or whatever was pursuing them did not intend to let them escape the caves. He added that this mission could be a one-way ticket. If contact were lost, Command would initiate a final liquidation procedure. Nobody was willing to take chances when entire region's safety was at stake. Sterling fell silent for a moment, shifting his gaze to Captain Dalton. He informed everyone that the group would depart within the next 24 hours. Gear was already being prepared. The unit would be equipped with heavy weaponry, video recorders, and explosives. At the slightest confirmation of danger, they had the authority to eliminate any obstacles, and if the threat spun out of control, the tunnels would be collapsed. A grim silence fell over the room. Those seated at the table understood they were about to face a mysterious phenomenon that had claimed the lives of professionals and left the authorities in the dark. Dalton gave a brief nod, showing he understood. Sterling motioned to proceed with details about their equipment and to confirm who would be in the group. The meeting lasted no more than an hour. They discussed plans to place mines, the possibility of setting up temporary camps near the entrance, and what to do if communication cut out in the first minutes. Ultimately, they agreed they would have to rely on teamwork and experience. Sterling ended the briefing by stating nobody knew if the soldiers would return. When the meeting concluded, people stepped out into the lit corridor. Dalton lingered a moment, looking at the map displaying the largest crater. A series of rare earthquakes in the Appalachians, missing scientists, suspicions about rare earth metals, and the deaths of several search teams, all of it formed a chilling puzzle. Now it fell to him to lead his subordinates into dark tunnels from which no one might return. Sterling spoke succinctly. "Departure is in the morning. Get your men ready." The captain gave a silent nod. The intelligence representative clutched his folder and tossed out a brief remark. "We're counting on you." Then he left, leaving an air of grim resolve behind him. Dalton headed to the depot, where they were already laying out ammunition. The soldiers asked no questions, but understood the mission was so dangerous that no one would promise them air support. Somewhere deeper in the headquarters courtyard, helicopter blades spun again, lifting another aircraft into the sky. Tomorrow, it would be ready to carry the unit to a place where many crews had already lost their equipment and their lives. At dawn, Captain Ray Fox Dalton received a folder listing those who would fly with him. The roster included Garcia, the demolitions expert responsible for planting mines to trigger potential cave-ins; Murray, a sniper experienced in covert operations under low visibility conditions; Hart, a machine gunner; Dorn, a communications specialist; Rains, the medic, and 2 more close combat soldiers to round out the team. All of them arrived early at the base, went through inspection, and waited for takeoff. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling gave a short briefing, reminding them of the main goal, reconnaissance. If the situation escalated, they had permission to destroy any dangerous targets, potentially causing the main crater to collapse. The government feared something in those caves might be capable of attacking people, and was prepared to take harsh measures. Sterling stressed that heroics were unnecessary. The priority was to return with information and, if possible, rescue the missing. When time was up, the team headed to the helicopter. The staging area was damp, the sky covered by heavy clouds promising a dreary day. The chopper's engines were already running. Garcia made a final adjustment to his explosives pack with quiet deliberation. Murray silently checked his rifle's bolt. Hart watched over crates of machine gun belts. Dorn fiddled again with cables for his portable radio. Even though Sterling had warned them that inside the caves, the signal might drop out anyway. The helicopter took off and set a course for the Appalachian Mountains. For several minutes no one spoke. Roads, forests, and the occasional buildings slid by below. Soon the pilot contacted headquarters. "We're on schedule, should arrive at the insertion point in half an hour." Static crackled in response. Dalton glanced at Dorn, who merely shrugged, acknowledging that interference was already starting. Finally, the mountain ridge scarred by huge fissures rose into view. The rocky outcroppings looked as though they had been ripped apart from within. The pilot scanned the area, choosing a landing spot about a mile from the main crater. Touching down any closer would be too risky. The ground could collapse or shift. The helicopter set down on a narrow plateau of jagged stone. Dalton ordered everyone off. The soldiers jumped out and moved a few yards away, weapons at the ready. The beating rotors churned up a cloud of dust, and within a minute the aircraft vanished beyond the rocky edge. The unit was left alone in the silent stone landscape. The wind carried the scent of dampness and looming disaster. A quick survey of the perimeter revealed abandoned vehicles, torn tents, and scraps of plastic. Closer to the edge of a massive fissure, they discovered a sheer drop. Sterling had warned them they'd need to descend those ledges to reach the largest underground chambers. Garcia and 2 other soldiers began anchoring ropes. Rains stood aside, checking his first aid gear. Dorn powered up the radio, testing whether he could reach headquarters. Only static and faint gargling noises came through. Their first charges were placed as soon as they made it down to the main cleft, which they had chosen as the principal entrance. Garcia tucked several bundles of explosives into hidden crevices. He explained to Dalton that upon detonation the ceiling would collapse, blocking any exit for whoever might attempt to come out of the cave. The unit agreed on code signals so they wouldn't detonate the tunnels prematurely. It began to drizzle, raindrops pattering against the stone. The weather heightened the danger. The soldiers double-checked their climbing gear and started heading deeper in. Below, everything was awash in the gloom before dawn, while up on the surface a pale gray sky still lingered. After descending several dozen feet, they found traces of an old climbing rope on the stone, suggesting that one of the missing groups had used the same route. Step by step, the team moved toward a partially collapsed cavern, where the temperature dropped noticeably. The clammy walls reflected the beams of their flashlights, and the echo of their footsteps magnified the unease. A faint rumble sounded in the distance, but no one could identify its source. Maybe it was just wind echoing through subterranean corridors. Or maybe it was something else. Dalton ordered everyone to switch on their video recorders. Garcia planted another charge, securing it near the entrance. Hart inspected several scattered metal fragments nearby where faded English lettering indicated that mining engineers or other scientists had once been here. There was no sign of the people themselves. When the team pressed onward, Dorn tried to raise contact again. Only static and a low hum filled the receiver. They knew there was a way back, but only in theory. Any panic could cause a cave-in. Sterling had told them to proceed with caution, yet no one truly knew what lay ahead. They continued, intent on finding out what had happened to the missing teams and on determining whether something hostile really lurked in these caves. They moved forward through a passage with a low ceiling and a cold draft in their faces. The flashlights picked up dripping condensation on the walls, the droplets falling steadily into shallow pools. Those first steps inside were fraught with tension. Nobody joked or chatted idly. Murray crouched by some rocks and picked up a scrap of blue tent fabric with a worn emblem, likely from one of the scientific groups. Nearby lay a torn backpack with an FBI patch. Dalton examined it, noting the label inside. It held fragments of a notebook filled with strange notations. Hart shone his light on a wall smeared with dark, dried stains. Rains suggested it could be blood. Garcia exhaled sharply, sensing that these remnants indicated the missing people had met a grim fate. They moved on, forming a line. After about 50 yards, the passage opened up. Fox knelt, pointing to scattered crates and overturned instrument cases. Quietly, Dorn remarked that the items looked as though they'd been tossed aside in a panic, as if their owners had fled. The medic leaned over a blood-stained outfit marked with the logo of a geological institute. Everyone felt it sink in. This underground complex was the epicenter of the disappearances. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound. Murray raised a hand, signaling them to freeze. The flashlight beam briefly caught a vague silhouette at about human height, but its shape was twisted, like some animal standing on its hind legs. It made a strange rasping noise, then darted into a side tunnel. Silence returned, but the tension spiked. Dalton gestured for everyone to check their weapons. They knew there could be an unknown predator ahead. Hart moved closer to the wall, covering a potential flank. Garcia and another soldier stepped forward. Just then, a creature lunged from the side and struck the nearest soldier, its claws scraping against body armor as the man cried out. The others managed to open fire, muzzle flashes lighting the corridor. The beast leapt back, apparently wounded. It let out a sharp wail and disappeared into another passage, leaving behind droplets of thick fluid. Rains quickly examined the injured man, noting that the armor had prevented lethal damage, though the claw marks were still deep. Murray stated that this was no ordinary animal. It attacked with cunning, striking from ambush. Dalton nodded in agreement. They proceeded now on high alert, scanning every bend in the tunnel and checking the ceiling and floor. Along the way, they found another scientist's backpack, scattered test tubes, and a couple of heavy cases. All of it looked abandoned in a hurry. Dorn tried the radio again from time to time, but no signal came through. Minutes passed, and the corridor stretched on, cloaked in a grim stillness punctuated by eerie, scuffling noises around each turn. Garcia suggested sticking to wider tunnels to avoid another ambush, and Dalton agreed. Hart, gripping his machine gun tightly, kept watch on the shadows, determined not to let the creature close in again. Even so, Garcia managed to plant additional explosive charges. If a single predator, or multiple creatures, tried to surround them. They could seal off certain passages. After another long stretch, the soldiers entered a grotto where thin streams of water trickled down. The air was noticeably heavier and breathing became more difficult. Every footstep echoed, giving the impression others were present. Suddenly Murray halted, saying he heard footsteps somewhere behind them. The group pivoted into a half circle, but the creature did not emerge. After a tense pause, Dalton gave the order to move on, weapons ready. He knew they couldn't simply abandon their search. Turning back might lead them straight into an ambush. His instincts told him that this attacker was stalling for time, launching brief assaults before vanishing. Perhaps it was waiting for reinforcements. No one said it out loud, but everyone thought it. Rains warned that the wounded soldier was feeling weak and needed further bandaging. In the beam of the flashlights, the medic quickly treated the scratches and administered a painkiller. Dorn peered into the tunnel, flinching at every sound. Someone was managing to follow them without showing itself. Garcia planted a couple more charges, attaching them to detonators. By now, the team had come to the realization that these caves contained something that attacked from the shadows and wasn't afraid of gunfire. Drops of its blood streaked the rocky floor, but it was unclear if the wound would prove fatal to the creature. Dalton ordered everyone to conserve ammo and fire only when they had a clear shot. He didn't want them running out of ammunition too soon. They complied, edging along the walls as they continued forward. Water continued to echo somewhere ahead. The group moved closer to the fissures where the damp air was flowing in. Hart, clutching his machine gun, scanned the side cavities, trying to eliminate possible ambush spots. Murray covered their rear, minimizing the risk of a surprise attack from behind. They advanced deeper into the cave, where the cold intensified and even their flashlights struggled against the thick gloom. It felt like their enemy had the advantage. The squad wanted to avoid being herded into a narrow dead end, so they tried to choose wider corridors. A passage with sloping walls led them down to a lower level. Wooden planks and metal beams suggested someone had been trying to reinforce this part of the cave, likely geologists constructing a route to transport samples. Broken equipment was scattered everywhere, including smashed carts and cracked containers. Garcia shone his light into a far corner, spotting something glinting there. When the soldiers approached, they found a person in tattered FBI gear. He looked exhausted, deep cuts on his arms. Seeing the squad, he lifted his head and mumbled, "This place reeks of death. It's a lair of werewolves." The last word hit everyone like a punch in the gut. The agent clutched his side, trying to stop trembling. Medic Rains quickly examined him and administered a painkiller. The man went on in a hoarse voice. "My team discovered there's a giant chamber inside the cave, an altar, where they're holding people, scientists, police, some National Guard soldiers. They're not all dead. They're prisoners." Dalton glanced at his team. That meant some of the missing could still be alive. The agent said his people had found cave paintings depicting humans transforming into wolves. He claimed time was distorted in here. Days passed as weeks underground, while only hours went by on the surface. He spoke of hallucinations afflicting those who wandered the tunnels too long. Occasionally, pain flickered in his eyes, and he let out a quiet groan. Rains dressed his wounds and checked his pulse. Garcia asked, "How many of you are left?" The agent answered that he didn't know exactly. He'd seen some become part of the pack, others lose their minds, and still others run into the tunnels, never to return. But he believed there were still survivors by the altar. He begged them not to abandon those prisoners. The squad hesitated, knowing that the exit above was closer than descending even further. They also knew the risk was enormous. Yet their orders were to investigate and, if possible, prevent a greater horror. Dalton looked his troops over. Nobody wanted to retreat, realizing that leaving now would doom whoever was still trapped. The captain spoke briefly. "We keep going." Everyone nodded, although many were anxious. The agent offered to guide them, insisting he remembered the way. Dalton suspected his stability was questionable, but they had no other guide, and maps were of little use here. Rains gave the agent water and another dose of painkillers. When he'd recovered a bit, they handed him a spare pistol. The agent held it with trembling fingers, promising to be helpful. And so an unlikely alliance formed between Delta Force and an exhausted FBI operative. They spent the next few minutes rigging one of the side arches with explosives. Garcia explained that if those creatures started following them, they'd need to seal off the tunnel. They kept Dorn close to the center because he still had the radio equipment, even though it was useless for the time being. Once everyone was ready, the agent led them toward the lower chambers, warning that there were many branching tunnels and the werewolves could appear at any moment. He repeated that word, werewolf, in an almost delirious whisper. Some of the soldiers felt a chill inside, but there was no point arguing. All evidence suggested they faced something more than a wild animal, possibly a sentient, predatory force or group of creatures. During a short trek, they all realized a crushing silence reigned in the tunnels. Only the drip of water running down the walls made any consistent sound. Occasionally, distant moans echoed, maybe just the wind, or maybe people. The agent kept leading them onward until they reached a wide passage from which a cold draft blew. Moving through it, Dalton and his team emerged into a broader part of the system. The walls bore remnants of ancient drawings, half-human, half-wolf figures, alongside strange symbols reminiscent of ritual marks. The FBI agent pointed out these images depicted the stages of transformation, as though the local inhabitants had believed in a power that could turn humans into beasts. Hart eyed the patterns with revulsion, his machine gun at the ready. The cave corridors continued deeper, forming a complicated network. In some places, they had to squeeze through narrow openings that only allowed one person at a time. Dalton realized that if something attacked from above, the squad could be split apart. Garcia fortified strategic points with explosives, running wires back to detonators. The demolitions expert planned to collapse certain ceilings if a mass werewolf attack threatened to overwhelm them. The agent shook his head more frequently, as though trying to fend off terrible memories. The medic noted he was running a fever. Others were beginning to feel unwell too, short of breath from the lack of fresh air. Somewhere in the darkness, they heard growling and the scratch of claws on stone. Suddenly, 2 soldiers went to check a side tunnel for a possible ambush. They came back reporting they'd heard sounds like creatures' footsteps. In one of the branches, the squad encountered a pack of werewolves that launched a sudden, ferocious assault. The enemy struck from multiple directions, using speed and clawed strength. The soldiers returned fire, bursts of gunfire mowing down any creature caught in direct aim. Several were wounded, but not all were killed. The survivors pulled back, as though luring the humans in deeper. Garcia noticed one soldier had deep scratches on his arm. Rains treated the wound immediately, worried about infection. The FBI agent fretted about werewolf blood affecting humans, but Dalton told everyone not to panic prematurely. They pushed forward, hoping to reach a more open area as quickly as possible. Within minutes, they found new intersecting corridors. Pebbles rained down from the ceiling, and in some places, water trickled in thin streams. The demolitions expert kept planting charges at critical junctions. The team split into two groups to cover the flanks. Dorn was ordered to stay near Fox, though the radio was still useless. According to the agent, the path to the cave's center lay ahead. He also warned that stronger werewolves might be waiting there. The soldiers questioned whether they should charge forward, but there was hardly any alternative. The medic reported signs of fever in several squad members, possibly from infected claw wounds. It became clear they had to speed up. Again, werewolves appeared on the right but did not rush to attack, merely growling from a distance, scraping the stone with their claws, then disappearing. It seemed as if they were waiting for orders from some leader. Dalton resisted the urge to open fire on all fronts, sensing the enemy might be trying to lure them into a trap. Instead, the team decided to follow the agent toward the altar to uncover the root of this nightmare and attempt to rescue any survivors. With every step, they felt the cave warping their senses. Dalton's wristwatch displayed random figures, and its battery was draining faster than normal. Dorn just shook his head, frustrated by the electronic gear's intermittent malfunctions. All of it confirmed what the agent had said. The squad pressed on, navigating dangerous sections of the caves. Their heads throbbed from lack of oxygen and unrelenting stress. Somewhere ahead, people might be alive in dire need of rescue. There was no turning back now. The choice was final. Move forward and face the enemy head-on. They edged along a dark corridor, carefully watching their footing to avoid hidden cracks. The FBI agent walked in front, pointing out the route, though sometimes he faltered and clutched at his temples. He claimed the ritual hall lay far below their current location. His words matched the scientist's old notes. Salt deposits on the walls and the broken rocks underfoot indicated a research team had indeed made its way down here, probably after discovering valuable samples. They passed several rocky outcroppings strewn with bones, among them ribs and vertebrae of animals. But there were also human bones, some still bearing tatters of clothing. Fox ordered Rains and Garcia to examine these remains. Judging from torn patches and scraps of fabric, some belonged to police or geologists. The demolitions expert grimly nodded, confirming that there had been brutal activity here for quite some time. The captain realized that whatever awaited them deeper below would likely be even worse. Farther along the passage, strange statues carved from solid rock caught their attention. Each depicted a figure with wolf-like features, as if the artists had tried to capture the merging of man and beast. The FBI agent said he had seen similar sculptures on the way in with his squad. One of the soldiers touched the rough surface of one statue and felt an icy chill, as though these effigies were silently watching the intruders. Moving onward, they encountered werewolves more frequently. The creatures didn't immediately attack, but growled and clawed at the rock, tracking every movement. At times they hid behind ledges, carefully observing from those positions, showing an almost intelligent caution. Fox grew increasingly certain that these beings were under someone's command, not acting randomly. The FBI agent insisted they had a leader, possibly far stronger than the others. During a brief pause, Dorn checked his watch again, noting the numbers changed erratically, even though it had kept perfect time on the surface. The radio battery was draining faster than it should. The medics suspected that not only time but the reliability of any device was being warped here. The agent confirmed it, saying the cave had the power to confuse one's mind. Fox tried to stay focused, urging the others to do the same. The deeper they went, the more they felt time slipping away from them. They might sense an hour passing when only minutes had gone by. That lined up with the agent's account of days vanishing in these underground corridors. Some of the troops were starting to mix up events, and only Dalton's strict commands and brief rests kept them grounded. Finally, they neared a large corridor from which a faint glimmer of light emanated. The agent said that beyond this passage lay the hall containing the altar, where the werewolves gathered. Tattered military uniforms, dog tags, and empty ammo belts littered the stone floor. Soldiers discovered some nameplates belonging to the missing, many bent at the edges and stained with what looked like dried blood. They understood that the next area could prove decisive. The injured soldiers were barely on their feet. Several were running fevers from old claw wounds. Garcia and Dorn proposed taking a break, but Fox felt any delay would worsen the infected fighters' condition. Besides, their remaining ammo was dwindling, and werewolves could strike at any second. The squad entered a massive tunnel leading to what the agent called the Central Grotto. Exhaustion and the stale air left them gasping for breath. Nobody wanted to turn back, because the mission was to discover the truth and rescue the captives. Cautiously, they emerged into a vast subterranean space, lower than the shafts they had navigated before. The light here was dim, yet enough to reveal the outlines of the walls and giant stalactites hanging from the high ceiling. By Garcia's estimate, the chamber might exceed 200 feet in height and stretch for many yards in width. The air felt stagnant and hollow, thick with the odor of mold and decay. Dozens of people occupied stone ledges and niches around the hall. Some lay motionless, others sat rocking back and forth, mumbling incoherently. Rains noticed they were alive but utterly drained. Many of them looked too weak to stand. Someone was dangling their legs over a precipice, gazing into nothingness. The FBI agent whispered that these people had long ago lost their will and were simply awaiting their fate. Fox frowned, confronted by this grim sight. At the center of the chamber rose a stone formation resembling a throne. On it sprawled an enormous werewolf, nearly twice the size of a normal human. Powerful muscles rippled beneath thick fur, and its elongated muzzle and yellow eyes gleamed in the half-light. It seemed fully aware of who had just entered. Nearby were several smaller wolf-like creatures on two legs, and farther off, half-wolf figures moved around carrying sacks of some sort. Fox also noticed humans standing near the throne, gazing upon the giant beast with reverent adoration. Seconds later, one of these servants, human or half-beast, escorted another captive to the throne. The prisoner walked forward, smiling as if heading to a celebration. With a swift motion, the massive werewolf grabbed him by the neck, tore his head off, and began ripping into the flesh with its teeth. The sound was sickening, and blood gushed in torrents. The squad recoiled in horror. Rains shut his eyes, but it was too late. The gruesome scene was burned into everyone's memory. The FBI agent went pale, recalling how his own team had witnessed something similar. Many of the captives perched on the ledges watched with indifference. Some even smiled as though possessed by a fanatical devotion. Fox realized that many of them had already snapped mentally. They might be expecting the same fate, regarding it as some sort of ritual offering. The team gripped their weapons, knowing it was far too dangerous to remain there. A decision had to be made. One of the wolves lifted its muzzle and caught the newcomer's scent. Its guttural growl echoed across the chamber. The giant werewolf raised its head and fixed its gaze on Fox. At that instant, the captain felt a penetrating force invading his mind, an alien will trying to override his own. Gritting his teeth, he fought the assault. A wave of strange numbness seized him for a moment, but his training let him snap out of it, regaining control. The huge beast did not rise from its throne. It only lifted one clawed hand and let out a short, guttural sound. Immediately, several werewolves bolted along the stone paths leading upward, intent on surrounding the intruders. Fox knew they couldn't afford to lose any time. He ordered the squad to fall back in search of better cover, or at least a position where they wouldn't be attacked from all sides. But just then, a voice rang out behind them. "Don't move." Everyone turned to see Hale, standing there with his weapon trained on Fox and the others. Hale's expression was calm, his eyes glinting with cold certainty. No one understood how he'd managed to slip out of sight. "You will be an offering for the Master," he said. "I'm not crazy. I've finally seen the truth. We will gain a new power, and this world will bow at his feet." The team struggled to comprehend that Hale had deliberately betrayed them. Someone blurted out, "Are you out of your mind?" Hale only sneered. He explained that the Master had shown him reality. "Resistance is pointless," he added. "These caves will be the cradle of a new power." By now, feral howls echoed from above and the werewolves were closing in. Fox understood he was caught in a deadly trap. Tightening his grip on his rifle, he realized there was no time for negotiations. Hale had them in his sights, and the werewolves were bearing down from above. Medic Rains tried stepping aside, but Hale fired a shot over his head, making it clear he wouldn't allow any attempt to escape. The squad was pinned in the middle of the chamber, unprotected and surrounded by hostile forces. One of the soldiers made a desperate lunge toward Hale, trying to knock the gun out of his hands. A brief firefight erupted. Bullets whistled past the rocky ledges. Hale ducked aside and staggered back, but something strange began happening to his body. His arms and legs stretched, bones grinding, while his face elongated into a wolf-like muzzle. His clothes tore apart over swelling muscles. In a matter of seconds, Hale shed his human form and took on that of a werewolf, eyes blazing and claws menacing. Fox couldn't believe the transformation had happened so quickly. Hale bared his fangs and lunged at the nearest soldier, slamming him onto the stone floor. His claws raked across the armor, shredding it. Hart, the machine gunner, tried to fire a burst, but two dark shapes leaped from a ledge and crashed into him, knocking him down along with his heavy weapon. In that moment, the entire chamber erupted with snarls and screams. The werewolves forced the humans toward a far recess. Rains fired at one of the beasts, but his handgun didn't stop the massive body, only wounding it in the shoulder. Garcia detonated a small charge near a side passage, hoping to drive away some of the attackers, but dust and falling debris only slowed them briefly. Hale, now a swift predator, darted among the rocks with inhuman speed. Fox tried in vain to maintain formation, but there were too many creatures, and even more were appearing. Meanwhile, the human captives sitting on the perimeter didn't intervene at all, as though they were numb to what was happening. Before long, part of Fox's team was pinned against the wall. He kept firing, hoping to repel the werewolves, but suddenly took a clawed blow to the head. Darkness swallowed his vision, and he collapsed to the ground, consciousness slipping away. While Fox lay unconscious, two soldiers, Dorn the communications specialist and Hart the machine gunner, managed to slip into a labyrinth of tunnels at one edge of the chamber. They raced under the attacking creatures, firing short bursts as they went, and vanished into a narrow passage, lost in the darkness. Those left behind were knocked down and disarmed. The werewolves didn't kill them outright, but crippled and bound them, perhaps needing live prey or further sacrifices for their rituals. As Dorn and Hart ran, they understood their chances of saving the rest were slim. Still, they couldn't abandon the attempt to contact headquarters. In one cramped corridor, they stopped to catch their breath. Hart had only a few rounds left, and Dorn carried an experimental radio transmitter. He dropped to his knees, trying to pick up any signal. Interference filled the airwaves, but after a few frantic adjustments, he finally broke through for a moment. A crackling voice came from HQ. Gasping, Dorn shouted, "There are monsters here. People are dying. Prepare to blow it." The transmission cut off, but headquarters had likely caught the key words. Almost at that same moment, the werewolves spotted the two fugitives. A roar sounded, and pursuers charged down the side passages. Hart gritted his teeth and tossed a couple of grenades behind them to collapse the tunnel, hoping to block their pursuers' path. The thunderous crash of rocks reverberated through the corridor, yet it also severely limited their own route forward. As stones rained down, Dorn managed one last word into the radio. "If you hear this, bomb everything." Then the signal died completely. In the outside world, people at headquarters might assume the squad was lost. Command would likely initiate a liquidation plan. Dorn and Hart knew that, but they saw no other way. They pressed onward along the cold walls, flashlights guiding them. Their harsh breathing and pounding hearts were the only sounds in the dark. Suddenly, three werewolves sprang from the right, and a brief firefight broke out. One creature took a bullet to the chest, but the other two closed in, knocking the soldiers down. Hart tried to swing his machine gun upward, but claws raked his face, drawing a pained cry from him. Dorn bashed one werewolf with his rifle stock, but it grabbed his arm and hurled him against the stone wall. In the end, both men were subdued and dragged back toward the chamber. Bleeding and slipping into unconsciousness, they couldn't resist. The werewolves snarled and hauled their prey off to whoever awaited them in the depths. Captain Fox came to on the cold stone floor, his head and back throbbing with pain. A dim half-light flickered around him from torches emitting black smoke. Nearby lay his men, many bearing bruises and ragged wounds. Somewhere off to the side he could hear moans and the rasping breaths of creatures. From deeper within, faint growls and malicious hissing echoed. Raising his gaze, Fox saw a towering figure just a few yards away. The werewolf stood there, head tilted as if studying the prisoners. Its yellow eyes burned into Fox's mind, stirring anxious visions. Smaller beasts wandered close by, along with half-turned humans who looked deranged and bared their teeth at their former comrades. Fox tried to rise, but realized his hands were bound with coarse rope, and his legs were partly paralyzed from the blow. He noticed Garcia had also regained consciousness nearby, yet the demolitions man's eyes were glassy, his mind hovering on the edge. A few other soldiers mumbled incoherently, and one lay motionless, showing no sign of life. Heavy footsteps rumbled across the stone floor. Emerging from the darkness was the one creature that the rest obeyed without question. The werewolf master strode slowly toward Fox and bent down until its muzzle was nearly touching his face. The stench of wet fur and clotted blood emanated from the beast. Fox fought the urge to look away, determined to hold on to his resolve. The master stared into his eyes. Suddenly, a foreign voice echoed in Fox's head. "You are strong. I feel your resistance. I will make you my heir." Fox realized he wasn't hearing this with his ears, but through his mind. Immediately afterward came a vision. He saw himself, already in a beastly form, leading an army of werewolves through endless tunnels, trampling every living thing. Blood-soaked images flitted before him, accompanied by a twisted sense of elation. His pulse hammered, and he fought to resist, but the vision overwhelmed his thoughts. Some of the other soldiers were slipping into a trance, succumbing to the psychic pressure. One who remained conscious began muttering, "We will become one." Fox understood he couldn't let himself plunge into the same abyss. Gritting his teeth, he focused on the echoes of his past. Memories of the briefing with Sterling, years of service, the promise he'd made to protect his men. Those thoughts helped him resist the monster's hypnosis. The werewolf master sensed Fox's internal struggle. It bared its teeth in a low snarl, revealing rows of massive fangs. Its eyes flared, as though warning Fox that refusal to submit would bring dire consequences. But the captain did not break. Clenching his fists, he tried to move his limbs even a little, testing the ropes. The few remaining sane soldiers looked to him with hope. Some tried calling out words of encouragement to each other, but the half-turned humans silenced them with blows. Others, having lost their will, bowed to the master, echoing its silent commands, as if their memories of a previous life were fading away. Fox realized they were running out of time. If HQ had gleaned enough from the broken transmissions, they would likely execute their final plan, leaving no chance of survival for anyone below. He could only hope the resulting blasts would wipe out the werewolf's lair. But if that happened, no captive would escape. On the surface, the military registered disturbing seismic readings. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling and security officers concluded it was too risky to send large reinforcements. If Captain Fox was still alive, he couldn't possibly get out on his own. Top priority was eliminating the unknown threat. They signed the order to bomb the crater without delay. A heavy drone equipped with a payload capable of triggering a chain reaction among the charges Dalton's team had planted was prepared for takeoff. Experts predicted the detonation would collapse every corridor, burying the source of danger. The officers knew these measures would almost certainly doom anyone left inside, but they saw no other choice. The drone lifted off from the nearest base and headed toward the mountain range. Its operators verified the coordinates, ready to release the bomb into the central area of the crater. Once the drone reached its target, the activation code was entered, sending the payload hurtling down. Almost simultaneously, deep underground, many of the explosives set by Dalton's squad began switching to active status as they detected the synchronization pulse. Down in the Master's chamber, terror and violence still reigned. Fox saw werewolves trying to break the last resistance of a few prisoners. Some were losing their grip on reality. A distant rumbling echoed through the corridors, but nobody yet understood what was happening. Suddenly, the ground shook, and a horrible cracking sound filled the vault. The first wave of blasts tore through the entrance tunnels and adjacent shafts. The shifting strata threw massive clouds of stone dust into the air. Temperatures rose, the earth quaking violently beneath them. Several smaller werewolves howled in panic and ran for cover. The captives on the ledges watched in horror as chunks of ceiling broke loose and came crashing down, crushing those who failed to get away in time. Then came the second shock wave, when the bomb dropped by the drone set off the main charges. A deafening roar reverberated everywhere. Distant corridors collapsed in a chain reaction, blocking off routes to the surface. The entire underground system began splitting apart, becoming a labyrinth of rubble and fissures. Cracks radiated across the floor, and some caves sank into the void below. In the altar hall, humans and beasts were thrown into frantic chaos. The werewolf master rose to its full height and let out a roar so powerful that Fox's ears rang. Falling stones rained down, but the master batted them aside with staggering force, carving a path for itself. It showed no concern for the lesser werewolves getting crushed around it. Its focus was on surviving and preserving whomever might still be useful for future plans. Bound and weakened, Fox could do nothing but watch. Several massive creatures dragged him closer to the master. Garcia and a couple of other soldiers were also there, barely clinging to life. Huge slabs of stone crashed onto most of the chamber, burying countless prisoners and werewolves alike. Dalton's squad was helpless, legs bound, arms slick with their own blood. People all around were screaming, choking on clouds of dust, and tumbling into gaping cracks. The FBI agent they'd found earlier showed no sign of life anymore. With jaws parted, the master snarled at the survivors, ordering them to follow it into a side corridor where the ceiling hadn't completely caved in. A handful of werewolves and the fanatical humans loyal to the beast herded Fox and the other captives forward. Another section of the ceiling collapsed, cutting off any return to the central chamber. Those left behind were crushed, their final cries drowned in falling stone and choking dust. On the surface, the drone operator marked a successful strike on the display. By every calculation, the operation was complete. Officially, no one below could have survived. With no further reports from Dalton's team, the assumption was total loss of life. Inside, the remains of the chamber were collapsing into a giant sinkhole. Passageways sealed off in landslides, the cacophony deafening. The master charged into deeper tunnels, apparently knowing the layout. His retinue followed, along with Fox and the few who had been taken captive. Stones rained down around them, and Fox knew there was no escape to the surface now. He could only hope the destruction might annihilate the werewolf's core power. Yet the beast seemed too strong to perish in a single cave-in. By the flickering light of falling debris, the captain watched as a section of ceiling sealed off all space above the altar. The spot where that monstrous creature had once sat was now entombed. Many captives were left behind under the rubble with no chance of rescue. Outside, the drone operator noted that the explosion had indeed reached its target. By all accounts, the mission was considered a success. No one above knew that the werewolf master, clinging to the deeper network of corridors, was fleeing with Captain Fox and several turned followers in tow, into places the main blast had not reached, where they could hide from complete collapse. Thus, the liquidation operation had destroyed most of those underground, but left the most dangerous creature alive, carrying Fox away into the murky depths.